Firstly, many thanks to everybody for joining this webinar. I'm Steve Ellis. I'm one of the partners here at Arcadia Consulting, and I'm going to be your host today. Thank you very much for joining the conversation about being change ready by design. In fact, it seems to me that in a world where change is ever present and constant and arguably accelerating and increasing in scale, that the idea of enabling our teams to be change ready rather than change resistance seems to me to be an economic imperative, as well as arguably a employee engagement, well-being and social imperative. So hopefully you find the topic of value and of relevance to you and your businesses. And thanks again for taking the time out of your day to join us. I'm joined, as you can see on screen, hopefully, by a fabulous panel of experts and experience. Firstly, let me introduce Izzy Homan. You can see the image on the left, but you don't need to look at the slide. You can see the person themselves on the panel there. Izzy works currently for Kroll as Global Head of Transformation and People. I've known Izzy, I think, for 13 or 14 years, dare not say how long. She's previously worked in leading organizations like KPMG, Deloitte, UBS, Manchester Airport Group, John Lewis, and has got a huge amount of experience in leadership roles, whether that's leading talent and leadership development or indeed organizational transformation. So I'm sure Izzy will be able to bring very practical, relevant and observed experiences around change and people change. Joining Izzy on the panel. So hi, Izzy. Big wave. Thanks for that. Joining Izzy on the panel is Sarah. Again, I've known Sarah for ages, so I'm really glad that Sarah could join us too. Sarah is the Chief People Officer at OCS, UK and Ireland. Again, got a history of working with large organizations, whether that be Tarmac, Philips, or Culligan International. Lots of experience in strategic and innovative HR. And as the note on screen says, really passionate about delivering economic results from a HR perspective, as well as employee engagement. So thanks, Sarah, for joining us. Thirdly, but by no means lastly in that regard, Freya Owen, who's a colleague of mine here at Arcadia Consulting. Freya is the head of research for Arcadia and makes sure that everything we do here at Arcadia is research and data-led, which improves our credibility no end. So thank you very much for that, Freya. Freya's previous work experience was as an economist for the UK government, and the connection to what we talk about is very much focusing on the behavioural responses or aspects of policy making. So where organisations and, dare I say, leaders make some policy decisions within enterprises, what are the impacts on human behaviour as a result of those policies? And of course, it was Freya and a number of colleagues that were the co-authors of the paper, the research paper that this webinar is talking about. So thank you to all the panelists. By way of an agenda for today, I'm going to be asking Izzy and Sarah just to answer a couple of questions to help frame this webinar. Questions particularly about the challenges that they observe in change resistance and the journey to change readiness, and indeed the costs or implications of leaders or organizations not helping their teams to be change ready. What are the implications of that? Then I'm going to hand back to Freya. Freya's going to spend 20 minutes giving us the headlines or the insights from the research undertaken. And then back to the panel to answer your questions. Many of you were kind enough when you registered for your attendance to this webinar, were kind enough to submit some questions as well. So we'll take those questions, we'll ask those questions to the panelists, and any other questions you have. If you do have any questions, feel free to put them into either the chat function or the Q&A. I'll keep an eye on the chat function and Q&A, and we'll seek to address as many of those questions as possible. If we don't get to answer all of your questions, either today on the Q&A or those questions that you previously submitted, we will be making sure that we do answer them and distribute a document with those answers to you in the not too distant future. So please don't feel like your question wasn't answered. We're obviously time poor here today. The session was scheduled for 90 minutes, but we will look to free you up after about 75 minutes. So thanks again for taking that time. And with that, I shall get started and open up a question to you, Izzy, if that's okay. I'd love to get your perspective, your lens, your experience with regards to some of the challenges that you've witnessed, either yourself or you've witnessed colleagues experience in overcoming resistance during any kind of change initiative.
Thank you. Massive question to start with, and thank you for the opportunity. I absolutely loved reading the paper. I think there's lots of really interesting bits in here. I mean, I've been in transformation my whole career, and I always think of transformation and change in two parts. One is the emotional response, and then one is the rational. So I think addressing those and knowing that both of those elements are important to people, us as human beings, is really important as you journey through any transformation. Typically, the most difficult resistance I've seen and faced comes on an individual level. It either comes to you as an individual leading that change and in some way or shape blamed for it, or it comes from an individual impacted by that who will vocalise and perhaps overshare those feelings and responses into the organisation at whatever level they sit. Both of those of which can be incredibly challenging. And I think knowing where that comes from for people is key, and being able to kind of think about that Kubler-Ross, change curve that was referenced in the paper. That's something I always refer back to. And in the moment, try and understand where someone is on that curve as to why they're responding the way they are, because it's very powerful and real for people how they respond to change. A couple of ways that I have found absolutely essential to get you through any change approach, whether it's something difficult like a restructure or whether it's implementing a new system, it is really around governance and authority around a program of change. So I was really interested in the whole angle of this paper around the mix of culture to the emotional and human response. And there was lots of different scenarios in the paper around culture, but I think governance is absolutely key, and it is important at the right point in time to know where the top-down decision is coming from, why it's coming, and then take people on the journey. So I would say one of the things that I always employ up front is, clear authority, clear sponsorship, clear parameters around terms of reference, and that governance piece. And then the other piece, I think, which was referenced a lot in the paper around collaboration, was the test and learn. So again, to try and overcome that resistance, especially on an individual level, engaging people in what that is and letting them play around with it or have an influence or a voice on it is really key. So those would be my two kind of things that I take into every program just to try and help the whole thing go forward.
Cheers, Izzy. Thanks for that. There's some great stuff in there. I mean, the recognition that it's emotional and rational, the idea that any resistance can often get vocalized almost disproportionately, and that vocalization can then become gossip or toxic, and it starts to impact others. I thought that was really a good observation. I witnessed that myself. And then your strategies around authority and governance to give you the mandate to get the change done, which is great. That gives you control and power, I guess. But then that recognition that it still needs to be iterative, that the receiver of it still needs to have a voice, and I'm sure Freya will come to that later as we share the research. So thanks for that, Sarah. It's implied, isn't it, in the question that there's some costs associated with not enabling change readiness and sitting with change resistance for too long. So what have you observed in terms of some of the costs or suboptimal outcomes as a result of not leading change readiness?
So yeah, thanks again for inviting me to talk this afternoon. Great privilege, and I'm passionate about change and so helping leaders be ready to embrace change, but more importantly, helping our colleagues be ready for that change as well, and taking them on that journey. So just to focus on the risks of getting it wrong, very recently I've experienced 2 large organisations coming together, and which should have been a hugely exciting opportunity for the business to win, but opportunity for the colleagues for future growth and ability to thrive in that newly formed organisation. But what I observed was just a catalyst of errors, if you like, in terms of setting out the strategy right from the top, everybody being on the same page, understanding the journey that we were going to go on, understanding the roles and responsibilities, that governance piece that Izzy's just spoken about, and then being ready to communicate the change with the organisation itself in terms of what's going to happen, why is it happening, and creating that sense of excitement and being part of the journey ahead. Sadly, the strategy was misaligned, the communication was poor, so the results were pretty catastrophic, actually, because what we saw was loss of talent. We saw loss of that discretionary effort that we rely on day in, day out. We saw colleagues being confused, contradictory messages coming out. And as a result of that, we lost business. Our customers were confused. So, 2 big organizations coming together, it was critical to communicate effectively to our customers as well, in as much as, we were 2 competing businesses. So what does this mean as a customer? How am I supposed to interact with my customers that were shared between me and what was my competitor in a sales environment? All of that was missed opportunity. So we lost business, and as a result, we lost EBITDA, which is, one of the reasons why we all come to work, is to deliver that profit to the business. And I think they're safe to say, when I look back now, they've lost their positioning in the market as well. So, and they've lost customer confidence.
Wow. So my headline takeaway from that is there's definitely commercial cost and risk. So EBITDA being one, customer loyalty being another, and then there's cultural risk. I'd be interested at some point to have a discussion about which of those can be fixed when it's gone wrong, and how long does it take to fix them? Can you turn the commercial thing around quicker than you can turn the cultural thing around, or can you not even do that without fixing the culture? And yes, the people risk, and I guess your observations around loss of talent, it's unwanted loss, and it's usually the better people that you start to lose. The loss of discretionary effort, which is what you relied on, and that confusion thing, that inertia, people are not sure what they're supposed to be doing, which means you get inefficiency as well as ineffectiveness. So thank you for the frame. I think both of you set it out really nicely. There's opportunity when it's done well, there's consequence when it's not done well. And the challenge of doing it well is both emotional and rational, and whether you have a mandate and whether you can actually engage the people in that change effectively. So I'm going to hand over to Freya, who's going to share with our listeners the research paper, or the headlines of the research paper. And I think you'll see some really strong connections to what Izzy and Sarah have just mentioned. Over to you, Freya.
So look, it's a real pleasure to be talking to you all today about our latest research. While some of what we found validated existing known truths, for example, the importance of trust and mindset in any change initiative, we also found some genuinely new and intriguing insights. So I'm really excited to share those with you today. Before we dive in, let me explain why we chose to study the topic of change and change resistance. The easy and quick answer is that it's a hot topic. Clients are increasingly talking about how to successfully navigate and lead both proactive and reactive change. So proactive, perhaps an internal shift in ways of working; reactive, perhaps responding to the disruption brought about by AI. And there are 2 groups of people at the heart of our mission to know more about how to thrive amid change: employees and leaders. So employees are becoming increasingly fatigued by multiple change. According to the Gartner Change Fatigue Survey, in 2016, the percentage of the workforce willing to support organisational change was high at around 74%. Now, that percentage has dropped quite staggeringly to 38%. So employees are fatigued and consequently less likely to back new and often compounding change initiatives. And then there's leaders who similarly are tired of and often overwhelmed by multifaceted change. Before 2020, senior leaders handled around 2 major changes per year. Now that's at 9. And how prepared are those leaders to manage such disruption? I would love to see what you guys think. How prepared are leaders to face future disruptions? What do you think? Around half, 64%, 72%, or 84%. This is according to a 2025 McKinsey survey of over 250 private sector leaders. So 84% of leaders feel underprepared for future disruptions. Now that's a clear majority of leaders who don't feel prepared to handle change. So why does any of this matter? We've got employees who are fatigued by change and leaders who feel underprepared for future change. What are the consequences in terms of real business impact? We've got retention issues. Employees with high change fatigue are more likely to leave. Similarly, at a kind of higher top talent senior level, leaders would rather quit than run yet another change program. Now, I can't see the faces in the room today, but I'm sure there are some leaders who perhaps might resonate with that. There's also productivity issues. Employees who are overwhelmed by change are inevitably feeling disrupted in their day-to-day flow. And finally, and I think perhaps most importantly, there's a missed opportunity here. So effective change leadership equates to real results. There's therefore a huge opportunity to gain from effectively leading and navigating through change, from learning not just how to survive, but to thrive amid uncertainty, and perhaps turn the multifaceted change that we face at present into a competitive advantage. And that is what our paper is all about. Helping you along your journey from change resistance to resilience to a place of readiness. So today I'm going to share 3 insights from our latest research. First, we will explore what we mean by change resistance, the science behind it, and what is within and outside of our control in terms of managing resistance. Second, what role does culture play? Now, knowing the audience here today, I'm sure we can all agree how important culture is. But what impact does it have on our collective ability to navigate change? Finally, what can leaders do to effectively lead change? And by the end of today, my promise or my hope is that you will leave with a greater understanding of change resistance and how to lead yourself and others through change. Let's get stuck in then. So we're going to start with change resistance. There are 3 types of change resistance. We've got emotional, cognitive, and behavioural resistance. So emotional is how we feel in response to change. Typically, our emotional response is our most immediate reaction. Perhaps we're fearful, anxious, uncertain. It's explained almost entirely by neuroscience. So due to our brains being wired to favour stability, change often activates the amygdala, which, as most will know, the amygdala is our emotional centre. And when it gets activated, it can disrupt our rational thought and heighten discomfort. Talking of rational thought, cognitive resistance describes how we think about change. So often this develops over time as we contemplate, rationalise and make sense of change. Our cognitive response has roots in human evolution. So if you think about early humans, risk often meant danger, and over time as a result, we developed a preference for familiarity and loss aversion. We still carry that bias today. So losing something familiar, maybe a routine or a role, often feels more painful than the potential gain of something new. And finally, behaviour. So how we behave in response to change, such as avoiding it or tackling it head on. This, as indeed all behaviour, is massively shaped by our social influences. We conform to group expectations, we're influenced by a majority, and we often define part of who we are through group affiliations. So our environment, our culture, plays a huge role here. So emotional, cognitive, and behavioural resistance. Let's consider then that final point about the role of culture and how it influences our resistance to change. To answer this question for the research, we needed a way of defining culture. So we utilised the very well known and very well utilised competing values framework, which is represented on the screen here. There are two dimensions to the framework. So we've got the horizontal dimension, which maps the degree to which an organisation focuses inwards or outwards. To the left, attention is primarily on people or process development, whilst to the right, it's outwards towards customers and competitors. The vertical dimension determines who makes decisions, and it represents the contrast between stability and flexibility. Structured organisations are, by definition, well organised, and they're typically hierarchical, whilst unstructured organisations are flexible and they typically come with a flatter structure. Now, there's a lot to talk about with the competing values framework, but for today, what we need to focus on is the distinction between structured and unstructured cultures. So structured have a sharp focus either on efficiencies or on performance, and they typically have quite stable processes, whilst unstructured focus on innovation, knowledge sharing, and agility. So let's see what we found when we explored the intersection between culture, according to the CVF, and change resistance. Our findings are represented on the graph here, so let me just explain what we can see. On the x-axis, you've got the two cultures, the distinctions I just mentioned, structured and unstructured. And on the y-axis, we have change resistance, with a higher score representing greater resistance. So the higher is undesirable. The red line represents cognitive and the blue line represents behavioural resistance. So 3 findings to share with you today. Firstly, you'll notice that there is no line for emotional resistance. It speaks slightly to Sushma's opening remarks there. Regardless of culture, people tend to feel emotionally unsettled by change. It supports the idea that emotional resistance is a hardwired human response. Finding number 2, people in our unstructured cultures, so the collaborative and creative style cultures, are more likely to think positively about change. That is, they have lower cognitive resistance. By contrast, the structured cultures, so competitive and control-like cultures, are associated with greater cognitive resistance. Thirdly and finally, we found a very similar pattern for behavioural resistance, where unstructured cultures, and in particular the collaborative culture, exhibits lower behavioural resistance. In these cultures, people are more likely to support change and encourage others to do the same. Now, there's a lot there, so I'd love you to just kind of pause, have a think about what I've just shared there in respect of emotional, cognitive, and behavioural resistance in these structured and unstructured cultures. Please do pop any thoughts you have in the chat. Does it surprise you? Does this resonate with you? Does it sort of validate what you know to already be true? I would love to hear your thoughts. And as you do that, perhaps let me sort of conclude this finding, what we think the research tells us. Unstructured cultures exhibit lower change resistance. That's what our research shows. Then begs the question, well, what are the defining features of unstructured cultures? And we had a lot of fun kind of diving into this. And we found some key things. So firstly, they have curiosity. Whether that's in respect to other people's views, perhaps in a collaborative environment, or what's outside of the box in a creative environment. They are high engagement environments, constantly exploring the possibilities of collaboration, creativity, communication, or iteration. They're experimentative, so they work together or innovatively to trial ideas, to course correct, collaboratively or otherwise. Finally, their leadership approach is empowering and adaptive. Decision-making in these cultures, by definition in the CVF, is typically decentralized, non-hierarchical, and thus empowering. Individual contributors in these cultures have sway over directionality. And these components are what we define agility to be here at Arcadia. So we have an agility assessment, and that's created based off hundreds of academic papers on the topic. And it includes these pillars almost directly, if not sort of indirectly, as foundational as to what it means for a group, be that a team, function, or organization, to be agile. So our takeaway, the kind of so what stemming from this insight, is the importance of agility. An environment with greater agility will exhibit less resistance and thus be more change ready. That's great. But what about leaders and teams who are happy in their structured environments? Now, as a side note, the CVF framework was created based off high-performing cultures. So there's no better or worse culture within those 4 quadrants, and thus you might have an organization that's perfectly happy in their structured environment, who don't necessarily want to become more agile. More generally, we asked ourselves the question, are there other ways to reduce resistance and effectively lead change? So to answer that question, we researched common change leadership strategies. So our research, which included interviews with senior change leaders, identified 5 key change leadership strategies, which are on the screen here. I'll leave these here for a moment for you to scan before asking you a question as to which you think is the most effective. I should point out that these are leadership strategies. They're not change management strategies. So they're not strategies for what to do to get from A to B. Instead, they describe how a leader should design, communicate, and evoke change. There's some probably that you're familiar with, like bottom-up leadership approaches, which are very sort of consensus driven, and where everybody across the ranks gets to contribute. And then conversely, top-down, which is driven from the senior team to the rest of the business. So, as I say, my question to you, which do you think is the most and which do you think is the least effective when it comes to reducing change resistance, based on everything you now know about change resistance? So which is the most effective and least? Comments in the chat, please. Okay, this is great. We're getting such a variation, which is, yeah, is interesting in itself, I suppose. Okay, thank you guys so much for participating there. I had a moment where I thought no one was going to respond, so that's always good. So what did we find? What did we find, sorry? We found that most of these strategies work in the sense that they reduce change resistance. So you'll see the x-axis for this graph shows a reduction in change resistance. So the larger and more positive a line, the better. Hence, the reflect and the information strategies are the most effective when it comes to reducing resistance, closely followed by bottom up and catalyst. So some of you were spot on and others a little bit off there. Now you can see one outlier, which is the top-down strategy, which actually appears to increase change resistance. Now, as shared at the beginning of today's session, that's not good news for business, for engagement, retention, productivity, missed opportunities, if we're utilizing a strategy that actually increases change resistance. Now, we wondered if this was the complete story. Knowing what we know about the role of culture in change resistance, for example, we wondered whether actually the complete story is maybe a bit more complex than this. And specifically, we asked ourselves, if we controlled for culture, would this hierarchy of strategies be the same? Drum roll. Before I share the findings and the answer to that question, to help kind of get us thinking about it, I'd like to recap what we've learned so far. So again, comments in the chat, please. Which cultures were the least change resistant? So the most change ready, the sort of best cultures when it comes to tackling change. Okay, the next question. Which leadership strategy just presented led to the least change resistant? So it was the most effective in that hierarchy, the best change leadership strategy. Which one? So the reflect change leadership strategy was the most effective at reducing change resistance. So bringing together change resistance, culture, and strategy. You'd think that in a perfect world, if I was a change leader, I would want an unstructured, agile culture, and I'd use a reflect strategy to minimize resistance and maximize the success of my change initiative, right? Actually wrong. So when we explored the effectiveness of change leadership strategies on change resistance when controlling for culture, we found some really surprising results. So I've left the hierarchy of leadership strategies graph on the right here. So as a reminder, this was without introducing culture into the equation. Reflect was the best, top down was the worst. When we controlled for a collaborative culture, almost the reverse is true. So the reflect strategy in this culture actually increases change resistance. It becomes an unhelpful change leadership strategy. Similarly, when looking at a creative culture, now both of these are the unstructured cultures, the reflect strategy increases change resistance again. So in these environments, suddenly the best leadership strategy is actually proven to be ineffective. What's more, you may notice that in creative cultures, the top-down strategy, which is typically the worst, is the most effective. Now, it might be that in these fast-paced, idea-rich environments, a clear directive provides the focus needed to move forward, perhaps reducing uncertainty and instability brought about by change. Now, I should say here that I haven't shared the control and compete diagrams, partly just because of time, and relatedly, they were less striking in terms of their difference to the average. Now, regardless of your interpretation of these graphs, and I'm sure we will discuss much interpretation in the panel discussion, what's clear from our findings is that there is no one-size-fits-all change leadership approach. Our research reveals the absolute necessity to understand, to measure culture ahead of any change initiative. Absent information on your culture, you may be using or choose to use a leadership strategy that has the exact opposite effect to that which is intended. To conclude, change is constant, and at the moment there's a lot of it. Today we've shed light on how to successfully navigate change. Emotional resistance is universal, yet how people think and act during change varies. In particular, less structured, more agile cultures are the most change ready. And finally, there's no one-size-fits-all strategy. Successful change leadership requires an understanding of culture and a careful choice of strategy. I hope that's been helpful. I appreciate there's an awful lot in that. I will pass back to Steve for no doubt a very fruitful panel discussion. Thanks, everyone.
There's a couple of questions that have come through. I thought it might be useful to actually get all of the panelists' views on this. Do we find, and I'm not sure that this was a part of the research, so this might just be an observation really, but do we find that the in vogue drivers of change, a more, I guess, in vogue driver of change at the moment being AI, did we find, or do we find that detracts attention that should be or is being paid to existing drivers of change like globalization, offshoring, that obviously creates organizational redesign kind of stuff? So are we seeing that in the marketplace? Do we notice that sort of this newfangled toy is somewhat diverting attention from other change initiatives? I'm curious to get people's perspectives on that. Anybody can dive in.
I think AI is creating anxiety. So fear of what lies ahead, fear of how far is this going to go, before it replaces my role. And I often relive an experience where I had a former business owner that told me categorically one morning, AI is going to replace your role, Sarah. It just won't be needed. To which I kind of thought, that's a really interesting thought. And actually, the only time that I would encourage anyone to be fearful of AI is when they try to resist it, because AI can actually help us go faster. It can help us make more effective decisions. It can help us think differently. I love ChatGPT, and I will always ask it a few questions every day, and actually it just helps me form my thoughts. It doesn't give me the answer, it just supports me. AI in all of our technology and all of our systems that we're using today, it actually enables our colleagues to have a greater interface and greater experience with those systems, so they get faster answers to some of those questions. So I think it is generating fear from colleagues and fear from leaders, but actually the time to be really fearful of it is when you try and ignore it and hope it's going to go away.
Yeah. I mean, that phrase, anxiety about what lies ahead, I think is true, but it also meets this other anxiety of not getting ahead. I'm worried about what's in front of me, but I know I've got to accelerate towards it because I'll be left behind if I don't. But in answering the question, my observations are, I think people are now utilizing it as an enabler of other change initiatives. So in itself, it might be a change, but it seems to me that people are increasingly using it as an enabler for other changes. We have got a load of questions. I want to get through them. Actually, Freya, again in the interviews, just curious. Paul's asking a question. Are there any? So we have this in the list of questions. This was a question that was actually similar to one that was submitted in advance. Are there any trends associated with change resistance? For example, is it being affected by generational attitudes? So we actually had that as one of the earlier questions. So this could be answered by any of the panelists. I'd love to get everybody's perspective. Is there generational differences between in terms of change resistance?
I mean, I can say a couple of things on that. One is, as a completely separate piece of work, we studied different generations, their motivations, their expectations for work, etc. And in doing so, I remember speaking to a colleague of mine who's maybe a couple of generations above me. And I very naively said, well, there's never, ever been more change than there is at the moment. And the stresses that we are facing, in my generation, which is millennials, are way above anything that's been experienced before. And he sort of gestured back and said, all jokes aside, every generation genuinely does think that, and every generation does experience immense change in whatever form that might be. So I'm tempted when it comes to the topic of change to not actually bring in generational differences. I think ultimately every human is different. Individual differences are important. And I think in the opening remarks, Izzy, you mentioned the change curve. I think that's very important to understand where individuals and teams are on that curve. But I think to kind of bucket people into generations and therefore assume that a certain approach will work with this generation over this generation is not quite the way to go, would be my take on generations.
Yeah, I tend to agree with you. I have a 19 and 22-year-old, so who have come through the pandemic, and sort of lived experience of how they are, certainly my older one, who, thinking about how they're going to take themselves forward into the workplace and constantly told, oh, mummy, it's so difficult now, it's social media and there's all these different pressures. And it is an interesting one, because it does make you think back to what were the stresses and strains that you faced at the age of 22. And I think that, the attributes you need today are exactly the same as what you needed 30 years ago when I was entering the workforce. And some of them you've referenced, Freya, in your research, which is around resilience, learning agility, that tenacity that people need to kind of come back from failure, and being able to draw on those things in times of change, I think makes a lot of difference to how people come through that Kubler-Ross curve, which I just honestly, it was developed for bereavement, right? But every element of that curve we have all been through at different times, and we can learn to go through it at a faster pace. We can learn techniques, but ultimately it impacts us all. So yeah, I think every generation of humans does face the same thing, but obviously what the generations face today that we didn't around social media is it's a very different force at work. But certainly doesn't mean we didn't have our trials and tribulations. I think as we entered the workforce, I was in a recession in 1992. How old am I? But it was hard. It's hard for every generation, I think, in the workforce.
Yeah, I tend to agree. We could go, okay, social media, COVID, global wars, instability, and then go back 20, 30 years and we'll go, well, okay, well, there was a financial crisis, there was AIDS, there was SARS, there was 15% interest rates. It's different things, but I feel like their responses are very similar. It's still an emotional response. It's still a cognitive response, still a behavioral response. It's still an anxiety. So I'm of the view that leading changes is almost, I would love it if leaders could do it on a person by person basis. And to your point, Freya, everybody's unique. I think that's quite tough, but where possible, it's the team leader, taking responsible for their 10 direct reports, the manager of managers taking responsibility for all of the team leaders, the leaders taking responsibility for the manager of managers. So as wherever possible, I think it's a personal thing. But thanks for that. Let's dive into some of the other questions that the listeners were so kind enough to submit before even joining today's session. It's very easy, I think, to fall into the trap of thinking the way in which leaders need to deal with change is to help their teams to cope with it. And we tend to sort of start leaning into this word like resilience and coping. Have you got any thoughts, and I'll address this to you, Izzy, about how leaders can help people to thrive rather than just cope?
Yeah, I think there's a lot of things when you're building the case for change, as you kind of start on whatever program it is that you've got to implement. One of the things that I do now is I always work with a change expert who kind of looks at the different personas that you're impacting. So we've talked about the two obvious ones, the colleague, the manager. Within that, you have, much more varied kind of personas around the workforce. And once you have kind of identified the personas and the motivators and things like that around those personas, I think you can start targeting some really thoughtful benefits. What's in it for me? What are my pain points? What am I going to resist? What's going to hurt? What am I not going to want to give up? Versus actually, what am I going to get? So that give and the get. And having spent a lot of my career in learning and talent, I think the offer of learning something new is really attractive to everybody in the workplace. So I would always try and wrap around some, self-care packages, if I can say that, whether it's a new way of learning something, if it's around the new technology, whether it's something around self-awareness. A lot of people, I am surprised, are not terribly self-aware. They might not have had opportunities to do personal insights, questionnaires and profiles around themselves. Giving people an opportunity to find out a bit about why they are feeling how they're feeling and how they can cope is also, I think, really attractive. So for me, that kind of how you can help people is what can you give them? What can you give them that's new? Give them something back. And And then the other thought I have, which is something I've started to do probably more than I used to, is when you talk about change, it's often something new and it very quickly becomes overwhelming. So I think it's also helpful to say, what can we stop? What is no longer needed? What can I do to free up that time that I'm now going to take on something new? And that piece, I thought, Freya, that McKinsey research is quite shocking, isn't it? That people they're overwhelmed, so much change, it's all fast paced. But most of the time you can stop stuff as you go forward with new stuff. And I think that is also very liberating and freeing if you can think about that as you're putting change in.
I love that. I love that. I like the persona approach and trying to understand, it's back to my point, trying to get it down to a personal level, a human level. There's a notion that, or an experience that people have, that where going through change is a shift in who they are, a shift in their identity, a shift in something that's been hardwired and arguably successful for 20 or 30 years or however they've been in the workforce. And therefore it feels like you're taking something off them. So I really like the idea of, in what way can you give them something for the ask that you're making of them? How can I give them something? And how can I actually take something off their plate, so that this doesn't just feel like an and, but it becomes an instead of. Thank you for that. Sarah, anything to add to that?
I was just going to come from an angle of making sure you're clear right from the outset in terms of, what's the purpose of the change. So, and make sure you communicate that purpose of the change in a meaningful way. Where I am today, we've got colleagues that, English isn't their first language. They don't just work for us, probably, and therefore we really have to think about what is it that we want them to understand. So think about the different kinds of people you've got in your organization, the different kind of layers, and make it meaningful and impactful for them to connect with it. And then, for me, it's around making sure your managers are equipped for that change journey. We just assume, and we've spoken about it in terms of leaders just being ready to embrace change. Well, then start with that in terms of make sure they are change ready to support and empathize with their teams as we enter that period of change.
Yeah, I like the communicate piece. I think it's important that leaders build a compelling story, to your point, Izzy, for each of those personas. And what's in that story is the purpose of the change, what it means for them, what we're asking of them, why we're asking it of them, and why it will benefit them in the long run. So really delivering a compelling story that's not just generic for 10,000 employees, but is tailored to those different personas. And I love that word, connect, Sarah. Yeah, how do you make the message connect, arguably emotionally, behaviorally, and cognitively to the listener, to the colleague? Brilliant, thank you for that. There's a question in the chat that I want to get to. I'm hopefully reading it correctly, and Jasper can edit my comment if it's not correct. How to challenge, I think, how to challenge the culture where people are okay not to accept change. So it sounds to me like there's an environment in which people are rejecting the change, and we're going, well, how do we deal with that? How do you deal with people who are just they're not having it?
Oh, I'm laughing because I'm probably in an environment that's a little bit similar to that. It's a nice environment, I might say. It's not a toxic, because that description could be toxic. So a little bit about Kroll for those who don't know Kroll. It's a fairly small global professional service firm, 6,500 people globally. The fascinating thing about Kroll is that our CEO is an ex-M&A banker who has bought over 40 companies over the last 15 years and, bolted them together to create this amazing, intellectually rich, amazing organization. Risk advisory, financial advisory. What's really fascinating about that, and to the question put, is that each of those acquisitions obviously came with its own MD, CEO, leadership team, And here we are many years later, and you might find yourself overhearing a conversation with a client that starts, well, I'm obviously from BlackRock, ex-BlackRock, but now I'm with Kroll, and this is like maybe 10 years ago or something. And so that identity piece that Steve mentioned earlier is so interesting. And what that does lend itself to is that individual MD is a really important person in their field, and they still feel they're running their own company. And so that resistance that the question asked around, I really feel that in the environment I work with. And part of our mission and our vision from the top is around one team, one Kroll. And I think that is probably a really important, and it probably, to Freya's language in the paper, is probably that reflect. You can't push that on people, but what you can try and help them on the journey with is the sum of the parts is going to be greater than your individual business. How can you, leverage your expertise into that picture? But you do have to have patience. I have found a new level of patience and being in the moment in those conversations. You are laughing, Steve, I know, but I'm growing as a person. But it is fascinating, because in their own way, all these businesses are so incredible, but they will never be as brilliant as the whole brand if we could only do that. And I know, Sarah, some of what you experience in your role today is a bit like that. So yeah, I think it goes back, doesn't it, to trying to understand the motivation of those individuals resisting it. And there is a really good reason, because it's the identity that they've carried for so long. But it's trying to play into that bigger story, which I think is so key.
Sarah, your thoughts on that at all?
Yeah, so similar actually. I've worked with many former owner founders that they decide to sell their train set, and that's my phraseology, I'm sorry, but and then try to resist being part of this larger corporate machine. And it's like, well, you had a choice. So naturally you start out in terms of, you listen, you are hugely respectful of their journey that they've taken their former business on, and then you're trying to encourage them to adopt a new way, new vision, to enable their baby to continue to grow and be successful as part of this larger organization. And again, similar scenario where I am now. So two organizations come together, but have been hugely successful in terms of the journey. So we've kept one name, one brand, OCS, and the other name has gone. And I've only been here 7 months, and in that time I have witnessed how they have managed to take so many people, so many colleagues from both of those organizations on an amazing journey, that people naturally now associate themselves to one brand. Every now and again I'll get yes, but I'm legacy OCS, I'm legacy, yeah, but it doesn't matter, does it? Because we're now all one. And I think it's just about making sure people still have the ability to respectfully remember their journey of how they got to where they are, but encourage them to adopt and be willing to explore the new world. Yeah.
It's like you, Izzy. I've got 21-year-old daughter who graduated on Tuesday, and I was sharing on this morning's webinar that she was anxious about entering the world of work, and she's got an identity as a student. I'm still a student with this identity. And it was interesting about the idea of telling a story of how brilliant her future will be. But I found myself telling a story of about how much change she'd already been throughout her life, and using her own life as a case study, or a set of case studies, to say, you learned to ride a bike and you were anxious about that. You learned to swim and you were anxious about that. You participated in the school play and you were anxious about that. And look at all of these hurdles and journeys that you've been on as you've developed your identity. And your identity is malleable. You can move it, you can shift it. And I said, after each of those accomplishments, despite obstacles, they will have experienced this sense of pride. And then one of the challenges around shifting somebody's identity is how proud they are of their existing one. And how do you help them to, I guess, trust that the future will be better than the present or the past, and that they'll have even greater pride in that joined up organization than they had in their legacy world or their legacy identity. And I think that plays into the importance of really powerful storytelling about what the future will be and how proud they will be to say, I work for Kroll, and I've worked for Kroll for years, and actually just merge in their history into their recent Kroll or their OCS. So I think that's a really tough question, and it's not a straightforward answer, but thank you for that. Freya alluded earlier that I can't remember exactly the date reference, maybe it was 10 years ago, can't remember. The average leader was executing two change initiatives a year, and now it's like 9 or something. The outcome of which might be change fatigue for the recipients of that change. I want you to imagine you know that they're change fatigued, and you're sitting with this really strategic change initiative, and you know that there's going to be some resistance, but this is really strategically important. What do leaders do to push that strategic initiative forward whilst recognizing that the recipients are already in a state of change fatigue? Not all at once.
There's obviously a really easy answer to this, isn't there? Because we're all thinking. I mean, I've already said a little bit about my, what can you stop? That came from, by the way, that was a really fascinating. I worked for Tesco in the 90s, again, back to my old age, but and in that 9-year period worked on 2 big change programs for the UK stores. The first one, first class service, was about pushing to be number 1. And then having got to number 1, everyone was absolutely exhausted. So the second initiative was called Project Simple. And Project Simple was literally as it sounds, where can you take out complexity and what can you stop? And it was really, really kind of engaging every single person in the stores to think about, micro processes of activity that they did that just weren't ultimately serving the customer. And I do think that, you have to try and go back to that paradigm when you've got so much change going on, and that classically from a program perspective you have to reprioritize. You've only got so much money, but also you know that the capacity of the organization is only so big to absorb that change. So I do think it's important, if you're a change agent, which I am, is to bring that challenge to an organization. Just because the world now says, oh, we're doing more and more change, doesn't mean the change is either effective or necessary or going to have the right impact. So I think all of that kind of, doing all of that analysis, that root cause analysis, that thinking through of, why are we doing it? What are the outcomes? What are the requirements? That's probably more important than ever as change gets layered upon layer, because there's no way organizations can effectively absorb a lot of what they do. And probably someone can come up with the statistic about how many change programs fail, because I think it's more than how many succeed. But yeah, it's hard. It's hard being that voice of challenge. I have to say, I play it a lot. It is hard, but that holding up the mirror, I think, is really important as well.
I think just to add to that, Izzy, I think authenticity is so important in all of this. So yes, when there's a sort of new change initiative that needs to be evoked, a leader or indeed a manager needs to consider what we can reprioritize. I think there's also a moment of just being authentic and going, guys, there's a lot of change. And actually as a leader, I feel that too, and kind of introducing a bit of vulnerability such that the leader, I guess, connects on that emotional level, so that the individual doesn't feel like everything's changing around me, there's no stability, and it's only me that's kind of struggling with that. A leader kind of coming, sort of being authentic in sharing in that journey, I think is very important too.
I think I love what you said. It's an irony, I think, that at the heart of the difficulty of change is usually something associated with fear. fear of letting go of an identity, a fear about what the future holds, fear of negative impact. So here we, which is arguably what the whole webinar is about, which is around resistance that people have, right? So here we are saying, we'd like you to not be resistant. We'd like everybody to be change ready. And one of the antidotes to fear is obviously courage. Courage to take on this new change. And I think leaders might need to sometimes take their own medicine and have the courage to challenge the prioritization of change. To your point, Izzy, to be able to hold up the mirror and say, of all of these changes, I think this is a strategic one, and I think so because it's got more value add. It will make a bigger impact. It will be more differentiating than change item number 9. Let's try and drop that. Let's remove that, and let's get that off people's plates. But that does take courage, the very thing that you're asking your teams to have in response to the change that you're implementing. I think there's also a space, to your point, Freya, for empathy and listening groups, and just making sure that we're close to people's response to change, especially if they're experiencing change fatigue. Sarah, anything to add to that?
The only thing I was going to say is, and I think it's already been touched on, is the fact that we should ensure that the leaders just, take time to reflect on their own level of fatigue and address that. But you can't address the nation unless you are feeling good yourself, or have actually taken stock of your own well-being and thoughts and mentality as you're going into something like this.
Yeah, good. Yeah, we just touched on listening and stuff. I'm interested. What have you seen work when it comes to leaders? And we talked at the top of this call to talk about the importance of measuring culture, for example. What have you seen work in terms of leaders measuring the resistance or the readiness, how people are feeling about change? What have you seen work well, or indeed not work so well, work well in terms of, I guess, that listening quotient?
So I don't think we should undervalue the value of pulse surveys. So I don't mean a full-fledged employee engagement survey. I mean a quick, short, sharp, that shows that the colleagues have got a voice, and makes them feel a part of the journey as well. They have an ability to influence some of the decisions even, but more importantly, that we're able to show that we're listening. So we do a lot of cheapy in, cheapy out within this business. And one of the things we do incredibly well is take that time to think about the communication, think about how we can show we're listening, colleague engagement forums, coffee corners, all those kind of things that just enable us to get that pulse check, and report it back. And then what we'll do is we'll take an analysis of what that data is telling us and then decide on the right course of action.
Yeah, that last thing's important, isn't it? Because you can have 100 forums, but the trust is eroded if they don't feel listened to, and the evidence of listening is action. And
we actually do, depending on what the change is, we'll do an update, whether it be monthly or whatever, and we'll actually show questions that have been asked, or we'll show the charts that show this is what you're telling us, this is what we're doing. So actually showing you're telling us, we're taking action on it.
Very good, very good. One of the obviously we know 2 of the leadership strategies are reflect and listen. Information, sorry, not listening. So reflect and information, and I think both of those demand a conversation, and to have a conversation demands trust, and to get trust you need some kind of psychological safety in order to have that. So I think psychological safety will lead to better information on both sides, the change agent and the change recipient. Get better information, and that process of being able to reflect and reiterate and deliver iterative change, I think can stem from that. Any thoughts, Izzy, on that? How do we measure?
Yes, I think, as you were saying it, I was thinking, yes, except when you're doing restructure. I think probably the most difficult change to do is restructure in the context of transparency, authenticity, and because it's a pretty painful process. But I think when you're doing, I mean, I agree with everything you said, Steve, but I think when you're doing restructure, honesty, you know, to pared back, because obviously there are some things you can say, there are some things you can't, but honesty, I think, is really important. And, you know, giving the reasons why, because even though people initially kind of, you know, there might be a shock factor and they don't hear everything and they don't want to believe it and they resist it, etc. If you come back to honest and then, you know, repeated kind of conversations and messaging, I think that is also really important. So yeah, I think, you know, the psychological safety is great until you tell someone that their job's changing in a way that they don't like the sound of, and that's hard, right? So, but it's also part of life, and I think what often comes from a restructure or a change to a role is often so much more and so much more of an opportunity, and that's what I always try and kind of share and disclose to people going through that, because I've been through it myself. And I think if, you know, back to that point of authenticity and being able to relate to people, if you can share an experience where you have had something similar happen, and then show that, you know, you're doing your best to follow a process based on that experience you had, to the best of your ability, then, you know, that authenticity hopefully will see the process through.
Yeah, I think the honesty word's really interesting. I think as soon as we can get to the data point, your job is changing, this is happening, I think the quicker we can open the cognitive growth mindset. It's often the unknown and the ambiguity and the lack of clarity and the lack of openness and honesty that's actually more frightening than, yes, okay, this isn't what I wanted, but I can possibly move on quicker with a growth mindset conversation and start to realize the opportunity. One of the a couple of the things, or one of the insights that wasn't shared from the research, in the interest of time today, absolutely was the importance of mindset, and how quickly leaders can enable an agile or a growth mindset, and that's very difficult to do if you're hiding information, if you're holding back. So sometimes rip the band-aid off and get the job done and move on to fixing the wound, if that's the right metaphor. Curious, Sarah, Freya, anything else to add?
I think that's interesting about ripping the band-aid off, because it sort of initiates the change curve, and if you're actually delaying the point of initiation, you're sort of delaying the point of getting, you know, through that curve and out the other side. So no, just to say, yeah, I love that.
And I would just echo the message around authenticity. You know, organisation change that impacts on people's jobs, it's job security, authenticity all the way. You know, being able to relate and empathise and just connect with that individual is critical.
Yeah, wow, good. I think we're nearly close to close. We're 70 minutes in. There's a few logistical things to wrap up on. There's a few things I take away, if I've heard correctly. One, from Freya's piece, it's important that we measure culture, because culture has an impact on change resistance and change readiness. I think that was it. Two, those agile cultures tend to have less change resistance and are more change ready. So it evokes an intent to at least develop agility or agile cultures. That seems to make some sense. I think that's probably both preventative and curative, in the sense that an agile culture might help with the current change, but it will also help with any future change. I think I heard, based on the culture, choose the most appropriate leadership approach. Bottom up isn't always right. I'm always reminded of the phrase, too many cooks spoil the broth. There's so much collaboration and so much consultation that analysis results in paralysis as opposed to action. So sometimes it is appropriate to do top down, but to make that choice appropriately, we need to measure the culture. Trust is important. Mindset is important. Authenticity important telling a compelling story about the change and the value of the change, possibly on a personal level, not just a corporate level, is also super helpful. I'm going to leave the last remarks to the panel, though. In any particular order, Izzy, Sarah, any other key takeaways for you or key insights that you can bring for the listeners today?
Well, maybe go first and Sarah can follow. So, I mean, I go back to what I said at the beginning, which is I hadn't really, when I'm thinking about change and implementation, I hadn't necessarily thought about culture in the way that the paper has put it to us. I think I do remember the one size doesn't fit all, because that's so true in all aspects. But I do think there are nuggets in that research that are super helpful when you think about those change resistant pieces, and you can then think about how am I employing or giving that information, and in what method. I think that's the piece I take away. I think that's really interesting to reflect on.
Oh, I agree. Thank you for that. Useful. Sarah.
Yeah, I think that the paper was really useful, as Izzy's just said, from a cultural perspective. And I've done a lot of reflecting since receiving the paper in terms of the culture I'm in now, culture I was in, and some of the experiences I've had along the way. But for me, my motto has always been and remains: change happens, shift happens, it happens all the time, it happens every day. And the moment we're not embracing change, well, I don't even want to think about that, because it tends to mean I'm not breathing, right? So and therefore change can be exciting, and it's within our gift as leaders to make it a journey that people can engage with and feel that they've experienced something positively and respectfully.
Why do I have to follow those?
Yeah. I mean,
we should have ended.
Yeah, that would have gone, Freya.
No, truthfully, what do I add to that? I think perhaps not a recap of the research, because you've heard enough from me talking about that, but just of our conversation there. I think the two things that have really kind of struck me are the need to be human in all of this, and meet our humans where they are. And secondly, to be intentional. And I suppose that is related to the research, right? To take that moment, even when it's crazy, to think about our approach to change and how we're going to lead and navigate it. So being human and intentional, Steve.
Very nice. Thank you, everybody. Coming up in the chat function is a link to the research paper. For those of you that hadn't yet downloaded it and wish to download it, just click on the link and that will take you to a download opportunity to get the paper. It will also take you to a link to what we're calling a discovery session. And what do we mean by that? Today, we've largely talked quite generically about change and change resistance and change readiness. We recognize that everybody dialing in today has probably got a unique situation. And the idea of the discovery session is either a team of people or indeed on a one-on-one basis, just to share with you how that research might apply to your world, or how your world could apply to the research, or indeed just to provide a little bit of consulting for you around your particular change that you're leading. So there's an invitation to both download the paper, and if you would like a discovery session, essentially a conversation with you individually and or your teams, you can just request one and we will do that free of charge for you. And with that, I'll leave you to complete the evaluation form and close by once again thanking my fabulous panel, Freya, Sarah and Izzy. Thank you for taking your time in both preparing and appearing and turning up and being so fabulous on today's panel. We really appreciate it. And for everybody listening, have a lovely evening and great afternoon wherever you are.